Thank you. Please, we welcome questions, and if you could hold up your cards, someone will collect them. But in the meantime, I'd like to start. So Chantel, you very rightly said that you are not here to defend the practices of
Nobody else is either. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no excuses schools or chains, and nor should you. But I was wondering if you could say briefly what you think distinguishes your schools from what's commonly called no excuses schools.
So I'm happy to do that. I think the other thing that I'd just like to say based off of particularly some of Leo's comments, I think that one of the things that's very interesting in terms of doing this work, and we hear a lot because if you come to our school, it's a pretty structured, disciplined school. I would say that, because I don't believe children can learn in chaos. Just like if this room right now, everybody was talking and up and moving, you wouldn't be able to understand what we're saying. And so this kind of criticism of the structure and the fact that we require things to be in a disciplined way is always so unique to me, because I think we say it from such a place of privilege because it's a norm. It's something that you know and it's something that you do. And so I'm always struck by that. But I think that the other piece is it's also, I hear a lot about, it needs to be engaging and intellectually challenging. And believe me, I agree that that's what it should do. I also believe that you have to have a foundation in order to have an intellectually engaging conversation. And so if you don't have basic number sense in order to then fully analyze how to attack a word problem or think more critically about math, I'm not sure how you can really do that. It may make us feel good if you walk into a room and you see that and you see, the plane and so forth. But if the children that we serve don't have that basic foundation in order to elevate it to the next level, I think you've done a complete disservice and just continue to create a system that is meant to hold people back, which is what our system does. But how is my school different? I think that I don't know. We actually, I love Teach Like a Champion. We use a lot of it because, quite frankly, I think just like when you think about a surgeon, for example, there are some basic techniques that every surgeon needs to know. How to use a scalpel, how to make a cut, how to do stitches, etc. But then it's that doctor's job to be very unique about meeting the exact needs of that patient, taking those techniques and making it his or her own. But they need a foundation upon which to start. And I think one of the realities of charter schools in particular, or at least let me speak for my school, we have an extended school day. We have an extended school year. We have a very, very demanding set of expectations on our teachers. And not everybody wants to come and do that. So the same people that love education don't want to come and put in that time and work in those hours and do that, particularly with a group of children that you'd rather just sat down as soon as you say sit down, or a group of children who don't tell you what they think of what you do and who you are in their space. But instead have a certain, foundation, and therefore come with a certain basic understanding, I guess, of interaction that our children don't necessarily come with based off of what America says they should interact and how they should look and portray themselves. But I think that what we do, I forgot what my thought was. Oh, you asked me how it would be different. So we take those same strategies, but then what we say to our, that's what I was answering. So our teachers come and they're young. They generally tend to be young, the teachers that work in our school, because they are pretty much the ones who will give that type of time and those hours, et cetera. And so we need to give them a basic foundation upon which to start this work. We don't stop there and we don't say that that's enough, but we need a basic foundation. But I think the thing that distinguishes our school, honestly, I would say has to do with the fact that I lead the school and I have a certain understanding as a woman of color of what this means, and having come from the area that my children come from, what we actually need in order to change the trajectory of their lives. So I went to one of the most prestigious law schools in this country, and it's because I got a specific level of education that prepared me to do that. I entered college and did not have to pay for remedial classes for the first 2 years in order to get a basic education that I should have gotten K through 12. And so I think that makes us a little different in the sense that we also understand that we are meant to be part of the community, and that we have no choice but to hear what our parents say, whether they are poor, rich, black, white, or in between, because they have given us the honor of educating our children. And I think those differences show up in our school, as well as the focus on character and the focus on the skills that our scholars need to succeed. I think it's hard to do that if you don't have that type of understanding of what it really means to be a person of color in this country that judges you before you even open your mouth. And so I think it's very hard to prepare children to live in that world if you haven't experienced that world. And I would say I think my perspective on that makes a difference, which is part of the issue when it comes to whether or not, for example, charter schools or no excuses schools are the answer, because they're not necessarily being run by people who have the understanding of what the children that they serve need.
Can I say something to that? I want to thank Chantel for her comments and for her passion, because I think passion is something that's important when it comes to to this conversation. I want to say that Chantel and I, we have a lot in common. We both are people of color. We both come from cities. I come from Detroit. I was raised by a mother who sold her body in order to take care of me and my sister. So I grew up in a brothel. I was homeless for a year. And like Chantel, I have a law degree from one of the most prestigious, institutions in the country, as well as a PhD in 4 other degrees, 6 degrees. And I've been in the education conversation for about 20 years. And I've seen the damage that we've done to our kids. What we're pretty much saying is that kids like me, kids who grew up in situations like I did in Detroit, that we don't deserve, a particular type of education. That the education that we deserve only is about controlling our bodies and less about our minds. She's right about foundations in education, but the foundations in education aren't things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. I'm an avid reader and a prolific writer, but before I became an avid reader or prolific writer, I first found an opportunity to fall in love with words. I had an opportunity to play with the secrets behind letters. I had an opportunity to beg questions. I had an opportunity to be curious and create. The foundations of education are things like pleasure, play, curiosity, creativity. And that's what's absent from many of these no excuses schools, that they have no foundation, that they suggest and start from a place that young people like me, growing up in situations like mine, don't necessarily have that humanizing space, don't necessarily have those creases or that foundation where the education or the foundation of education is something that's more human. And I think that's something that we have to deeply challenge. If I go, if I grew up in Detroit and I go 10 miles, north to West Bloomfield, one of the most affluent spaces in Michigan, I go into classrooms where, students are asking questions. They're not in rows, but in circles. They get to sit in seats or on bean bags, and they get to play and they get to bet curiosities. I was in a school last week in the South Bronx. A student had his hand up. He said, Miss, I got a question. And the teacher told me, this was a Success Academy school. He said, Miss, I got a question. His teacher yelled at him and said, we don't ask questions in here. My heart sank. Like, if you don't ask questions in school, where do you ask questions? Of course we should ask questions in school. And of course we should play in school. And of course there should be productive chaos and noise in school. And of course there should be adults who can build community and help to facilitate and manage the productivity of that noise. We need less police, more facilitators of learning. Because too often that's all we get. All we get are police. All we get is strict discipline. All we are known for are our bodies in ways that our bodies can be controlled and less about our minds.
Thank you. I'm wondering, and there's a lot of passion here and a lot of dedication to students and their well-being. And I wonder also if there isn't some room for common ground. I mean, I know that there is a lot of the problem or a lot of the criticism of the No Excuses schools is the perception of their rigidity and harshness in terms of the treatment of students and the limitations of their curriculum. But there's also a lot of research that shows that some of the practices, such as a lot of extended learning time, it has benefits in terms of student achievement as measured by test scores?
I think if we go into this rabbit hole of dissecting the curricular practices and the instructional practices, we're losing part of the point. And a large part of the point is that much of this urban school reform conversation is not about children.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about curricula. It's not about instruction. It's about a group of billionaires who believe that we need less public space, whether that public space is called government or schools. And so it really disturbs me that we go into the rabbit hole and begin the analysis of the curriculum, what the children are experiencing, and we don't interrogate why this movement around no excuses schools, whether my colleague represents the voice of all of those or not, when she says she does not, but why we're not interrogating these billionaires' intention and motive and end game. To me, that's the real issue. This is not about a movement that's been led by authentic, knowledgeable, community accountable, Black educational thought or leadership. And that's problematic because we're talking about Black, brown, and poor children. And there's very little diversity in the group that's leading and funding the no excuses schools. Very little diversity there, almost no diversity there. And I don't know why we're not interrogating why these billionaires aren't building jobs rather than tinkering with schools, when we know from nearly 60 to 70 years of research that building jobs is the best thing that can happen for low-income communities. When you rescue an African-American female parent out of poverty, you automatically give her child more quality school options and a better chance at academic achievement. So I'm just encouraging us not to be fooled that by delving into these Tayloristic notions of curriculum and instruction, and remember, there's a beautiful article about Taylor as a person who had psychiatric problems. I remember reading that some years ago. So the Tayloristic notions of curriculum and instruction are problematic in and of themselves and were evolved by a theorist who had psychiatric issues. The insult to injury is this, I think about the Last Poets Society, Automatic Systematic Remote Control. And I think that song, everyone needs to Google that and listen to every single word. It's not just an artistic flourish. It's really happening in schools that serve Black, brown, and poor children. And so if you ask me, then what's the solution? I've taught in these schools, and remember I began by saying that I've taught Black students successfully from kindergarten through the doctoral level. I find nothing in this movement informed by the people who've done that work. And most of the national conversation that occurs here and on Capitol Hill, the group that's leading the conversation is spotted with diversity. It's not a panel like this. It's probably one of the few times you've seen a panel like this, okay? You go on Capitol Hill, you look at the legislative staffers, you look at the agents, the sycophants, the pawns, the acolytes of the billionaires. It's a remarkably undiverse group, and one of the lessons that we know from American democracy is when there's not diversity of thought in the room, the diversity of solutions is certain to fail. And I think that's where we are right now. The individuals who are leading the conversation about the education and socialization of Black, brown, and poor children are not the individuals largely who have the microphone and are driving the agenda. And when we find Black, brown, and poor people in the room, too many times they're the acolytes and pawns of the billionaires and the others who are leading the conversation. That's been my experience, not having joined education as a sidebar, but having been involved in this work in public schools, in private schools, at historically Black colleges, and as affiliated with some of the nation's most prestigious institutions, and having done the work successfully.
So I'd like to say that I do think that one thing all of us up here share is the passion about the education of these children. Over 30 years ago, I thought I was taking a brief break from finishing my doctoral dissertation to teach in high school. And I fell in love with the kids I was teaching. And I never used that dissertation to go teach in a college. Because making a difference in the lives of kids, and those were the years of the crack epidemic in New York City. And if you think things are bad today, it was years in which, you know, kids were being murdered inside schools and outside our schools. You know, shooting was a fairly regular occurrence, and society as a whole had just abandoned poor kids. But I think it's important, precisely because of that passion, to get down to some of the questions that may divide us on how to move forward. And so one of the things that I think is true of creating a culture of behavior for students in most no excuses charter schools is the idea that order is synonymous with students sitting quietly, students walking quietly in the hall, in some cases students not even talking with each other at lunch. And it is precisely what students need to be able to learn is not how to be quiet, but how to have voice in a way that dialogues with other young people and shares with other young people. We have been struggling in the Schenker Institute with this question of discipline and the fact that children were being expelled from pre-K for behavioral issues. You know, there was a lot of outrage, but there was very few people who actually started to try to figure out what was happening and went and talked to the teachers and say, what's going on here? And the teachers, by the way, were completely opposed to the expulsions. They said, you expel a kid from pre-K and the kid is back in kindergarten with the same issues and you've done nothing to help the kid next year, and you can't expel them next year. So you haven't done it. But what appears to be a very important part of this problem is that generally kids go through a developmental stage where they pass from communicating with behavior to communicating with words. So the kid no longer has temper tantrums, no longer pushes, no longer does all of the physical things to communicate how they feel. They can actually communicate with their words. And a lot of these problems in pre-K were kids that weren't making that transition well. And they actually needed the help to learn how to communicate how they felt with their words. And so a culture which puts a premium on silence is a culture which precisely doesn't help address what those kids need.
I have a question for Dr. Fenwick, which is, as a Dean of Education, the topic and conversation about education of students, of poor students of color are often, as you noted, led by people who are not of color. What is the research from Black scholars regarding what we should be doing in schools to meet the needs of impoverished students of color?
I began my comments by saying I came here today not as dean but as a teacher, and I just want to reiterate that that I come here today as a teacher, someone who's successfully engaged in this work for quite some time. I think the work of Black scholars has been very, very clear. I mean, I think about James Anderson's work, who talks about the deep commitment that Blacks have had since they landed in this country to education. I think it's a book that all of us need to read, The Education of Blacks in the South. It's a phenomenal history about the commitment of Black parents to ensure that their children were educated. I think about the work of Jackie Irvine. I think about the work of Mary Dilworth. There are many Black scholars who have been speaking to this, to these issues, and I could go on, but I think there is a core to much of their work. and it's a pushback, and I hear it from my colleague, it's a pushback on this litany of pathology that seems to dominate our understanding about Black children. You know, there's no, we don't need to determine, if we think as a nation that we have a discovery problem, how do we educate these Black and brown children? You know, we all use this poetry voice. How do we, if we think we have a discovery problem, that's our problem. This is not a discovery problem. We know how to educate children in this country, unless the child is brain dead. We know how to educate children. But we act like we have a discovery problem when it comes to Black and brown children and children captured in poverty. What we have is a resource problem. And more than the resource problem, we have a will problem, and we've talked about that a lot. But I want to unpack this litany of pathology notion, and I want to do it by asking this audience, which is a knowledgeable audience, 3 questions. Okay? The first question, and this is not Fenwick data, this is the National Center for Ed Statistics data. But the first question is, what percentage of African American parents say that they assist their child with homework and set aside a special time in the household for homework to be completed and have an adult check that homework? So what percentage of African American parents in survey data indicate that they assist their child with homework, they have an adult in the household check that homework, and they set aside a special time for the review of that homework, for the child to do his homework or her homework? 94%. 94%. Okay, second question. What percentage of Black parents and white parents attend PTA meetings? 88% of white parents, 87% of Black parents. Last question. Are there more Black men in prison or in college? I'll let you answer that. Are there more Black men in prison or in college? There are more Black men in college than in prison. There are 1.4 million Black men in college, 840,000 Black men in prison. Too many Black men in prison, but there are more Black men in college than in prison. I could ask 10 of those questions. Some of them are listed in an article that I wrote, Upending Stereotypes About Black Students. The reason I raise that is because Black scholars, much of their work has been about interrupting this litany of pathology and the misdirected answers that come out of that litany of pathology that drive policy and practice interventions and shape our thought, and confuse cross-racial dialogue, and actually short-circuit authentic cross-racial dialogue.
I should just point out that that article is in your packet.
You know, Leo mentioned teaching in New York, I think he said New York schools, and being in those school settings when crack invaded those communities. And while he was talking, I just wrote down some statistics about crack cocaine usage. 68% of crack cocaine usage in this country is by whites. 72% of powder cocaine usage in this country is by whites. 60% of the people who used crack cocaine last month were white. And yet Blacks are incarcerated at rates 10 times their white citizen peers. Okay? These kinds of data, these kinds of perspectives reshape some common notions that we all come to the table with as we seek policy solutions, funding solutions, reframing of policy and practice. And I think it's the work of all scholars, not just Black scholars, but Black scholars have been particularly aggressive about this, unpacking this litany of pathology that's misdirecting all of this. On top of the misdirection, we have billionaires out there who say we have the solution to all of this, and we want to dumb down the curriculum and put these children, these Black, brown, and poor children, in these automatic, systematic, remote-controlled schools. It's insulting. It is absolutely, it's hard to have a polite conversation about this. Over and over again. Black scholars are called on to be polite about this nonsense.
There is a question, there's a reference about Brown v. Board of Education. And what do the panelists think about school integration racially and socioeconomically as a potential solution to inequality?
So let me repeat the question so I can make sure I get it right. What do we think about school integration as a solution?
As a solution to inequities in schooling in the U.S. population.
Yeah. So at Metro Center, NYU Metro Center, we're doing a lot of work around resegregation. New York City has some of the most segregated schools in the nation. You know, students, who are predominantly affluent, white and Asian, they attend some of the city's best schools. The city's worst schools are, populated, by Black and brown populations, who come from very low socioeconomic backgrounds. I think the conversation around integration of schools is a necessary conversation to have. We've pursued policies that don't necessarily integrate our schools, however. But it's not just integration of bodies. When we left Brown, we didn't integrate some of the solutions that Black scholars had come up with. Gloria Ladson-Billings writes about culturally relevant pedagogy. She writes about culturally relevant pedagogy because when students like you are bused into suburban schools, you don't get to read books that look like you or sound like you or feel like you. And it's precisely at that moment, at that place of segregation or the imposition of a particular culture on young kids that these kids don't see themselves, but instead see themselves as failing. And so I think the integration question has to be deeper. It must go into curriculum and it must go into knowledge. Pedro Noguera talks about broader, bolder approaches to education. He's talking about integrating the school into the community, right? So this is another way to imagine integration. Jeffrey Canada in New York City achieved a lot with Harlem's Children's Zone because he was able to integrate, the school within the community. And I think that moment of integration becomes important. This is another solution that we get from, a Black scholar. I think another way to think about the integration or segregation conversation, is from a place of apathy. Gloria Ladson-Billings talk about, Brown versus Board of Education hasn't necessarily given us success. And she said, I want Plessy back. The general sentiment here is that, when, communities of color and communities of people who cared about, the young people who attended those schools were making decisions for those schools, those young people typically did better. And I get the impetus, right? I get what she's saying. Because for me, it raises a set of questions. I can go to Wyoming, I can go to Vermont, I can go to New Hampshire, I can go to Maine, I can go to Iowa and Nebraska, where schools are not just predominantly white, where they're 100% white. And those students receive a quality and valued education. But if I go into my own backyard here in Baltimore or Washington to a school in DC, where the students are 100% Black, the question of integration, the idea that education success only comes when I exist in a situation that is fractured, a situation that doesn't necessarily look like me. The question that I have is, why can one homogeneous group be ensured quality education and another homogeneous group can't? So for me, that integration question is complex. Yes, I want integration. I want integration of a lot of things, more than just bodies. But I have this stable question: why is integration the answer? Can we have quality education for our most vulnerable students? Not based on the logics of normalizing the dominant group, but based on this idea that we care about all kids.
And we stopped the work of Brown. We know we had Brown the Brown decision and then Brown 2. But we've never integrated the teaching workforce. And so our children, whether they're black or white, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, First American, suffer from a non-integrated teaching force and school leadership workforce. This notion, and the problem with that is that the notion of who is a model of intellectual authority suffers. You know, it's been, you know, since the 80s when the Carnegie Commission on Education and the Economy said the nation can ill afford to have its children experience exclusively white authority figures in their schools and classrooms. And yet less than 8% of the nation's teachers are people of color, are teachers of color. And there's a very explicit history to why that is so, particularly the shattering of the black teacher pipeline that accompanied white resistance to Brown after the Brown decision. It's not that blacks with desegregation fled the profession and went to other professions now that we had integration. The black teacher and principal pipeline was purposely shattered because we were not going to have a circumstance where white children in integrated schools would be taught by black teachers in schools led by black principals. Prior to the Brown decision, in the 16 states that operated dual education systems, 35 to 50% of the teachers were black. By 1972, there was no state that had that statistic in terms of the percentage of black teachers. The problem was such an issue, the issue became such a problem that there were a series of Senate hearings about the displacement of black teachers and principals. So one of the things that we still need to press for is integration of our teaching force. Who are the models of intellectual authority before the nation's children? Who are those models? What do they look like? The more diverse those models are, they teach all of the nation's children that we all have a right to engage in knowledge generation, that we all have a right to spaces where our creativity is valued, where curiosity is the play of all people, not just a certain group of people who fit a certain demographic profile.
This question is for Chantel Wright. Oftentimes, no excuses schools are concentrated in elementary and middle school, and often the structures can't be replicated at the high school level, leading students to struggle to adjust when transitioning from middle to high school. How do we set students up for success in this transition?
Wow. You know, I don't know that I think it's about the no excuses model or et cetera in terms of elementary, middle. I think the bottom line is regardless of the type of school that scholars leave going from middle to high school, that they've got to be prepared and they need to have a certain foundation and a certain ability to think critically and analyze information. So I don't know that I know the answer to that question in terms of like what the exact answer is. I think for us, we think about what are the skills that they need to be successful in college and how can we, having them up to 8th grade, prepare them for that. And then how do we think about supporting, because we actually support our scholars after 8th grade into high school and through high school into college. And so our first class is graduating from high school this year. But I think it's about making sure that when they leave us at 8th grade that they're going to schools that are going to continue to support their trajectory, that are going to continue to support their learning and their thought process. But I don't know that I know the answer to that
Could you
question.
say a little bit more about what you do to support your students as they leave your schools and enter into high school?
Sure, and I think that's the hard part, right? And that is the question of when you get into the billionaires who want to give you a certain amount of money to do this work, and when you have to make tough decisions. For us, what we do is we literally have a high school placement program that works with each of our scholars and their families to think very critically about their next move and what it is that they want to do. We personally help every child apply to high schools. Unfortunately, many of them have to leave their neighborhoods to go to what's deemed a quality school or a school that will continue to challenge them academically and will also support them emotionally, because I think going back to David's point around integration, I think somewhere along the line we thought that if we add white to homogeneous black communities that somehow it gets better. That's not the answer. I went to all black college and it was just fine and I came out very well. So I don't know that I think it's about that. But we think about for each and every child where they go next, and then part of what we do with our families, which goes to I think how we think about our families very differently, is integrating the parents in that process and making sure that they know and understand what high school looks like, and that we're always a resource to our families. And so we have them also commit with us that we can get the report cards, we can go to parent-teacher conferences. We have hired a team called High School Placement Coordinator and Alumni Support Coordinator that their sole job is to work with children through high school and getting them to college. I don't know how far we'll be able to go after college because it's a pretty expensive endeavor. But then we go to their parent-teacher conferences. We support what's happening. They come back. We've created spaces within our school where they come back to the alumni suite, and that's where they come to get help with math, English, whatever it is that they're dealing with and struggling with in their respective schools. When they have to do community service, they do it back within their school. So like today, Banneker is closed, so we've got like 12 scholars at our school giving community service. They're in the 4th grade classes reading, they're in the kindergarten classes supporting. And so we think very critically about what that looks like and really actually work with parents about what a high school choice looks like and what that school will give. And I think a lot of times our parents are they're excited because their scholars can now pass a test that will get them into a certain school that maybe before they wouldn't have gotten into. And we have to have very real conversations about whether or not that is the best school, because getting in and being successful are two different things. And so we talk about that very critically with our families, but we follow them. We follow them all the way through, whether they go to their local neighborhood school, or we've got children in Deerfield, Massachusetts boarding school. We've got children in school in Virginia, and we follow them and we go see them and we take care of them all the way through. That's our commitment. My concern, honestly, as a school leader, is how sustainable is that, right? Mm-hmm. So my first classes were very small classes. My first class was only 25 of them that graduated, right? Now I've got classes of 100. How do I support them moving forward, and what does that look like? Is a concern of mine in our organization, because it is important that we don't just get them to 8th grade.
Mm-hmm. And this question I will give to Leo. What are the short and long-term implications of the fact that states are playing politics with Common Core, and how does that relate to the prospects for successful education of Black, brown, and poor students?
You gave me the easy questions. Right? So I think what Common Core did was, through most of the country, it produced a set of standards which actually were an improvement over existing standards in terms of the sorts of things that we think a educated young person should be able to do: analytical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving, being able to express oneself clearly in logical form, orally and written. What happened, unfortunately, with the Common Core, and it is an open question about what the final result will be, was that the implementation was done very poorly. Teachers were not prepared to make what were significant shifts in instruction to different and more challenging standards. Tests, we went to tests very quickly with students without students having the chance to be properly prepared for the tests. Students did poorly. And so we're now in a situation where people, for example, in New York State, think of the Common Core as a set of inappropriate tests that set students up for failure, rather than as a set of standards that would be useful for instruction. So I think, how does that relate to Black and brown students? I think this is there are many instances where the problem is as simple as that those standards would be as appropriate for Black and brown students as they would be for white students. The issue is the sort of resources and the supports, the preparation that Black and brown students get. On this previous question, I was sitting here thinking about the issue of integration, and the problem is that we've always, as a country, approached the issue of integration with the notion of separation, and forgetting that we were dealing with separate and unequal. And until we're able to take on both of those issues and deal with the inequality element as strong as we deal with the separation element, I don't think we're going to be successful as a nation in terms of our educational system.
There is one more question, and then I'm going to ask you to give any concluding remarks. The last question is for Leslie about whether there's any encouraging support from Black citizens with great wealth, like athletes and entertainers, in terms of improving the education of students of color. Is it all just white billionaires?
Yes, it is. Right now it is. That's who's funding and leading this movement. So yes. I don't think that we should have to rely on movements and the consciousness of the nation's uber wealthy to educate the nation's children. Okay? We say we have a commitment to democracy. We say we have a commitment to protecting and nurturing children. And the dime shouldn't turn on the nation's uber wealthy.
Good answer. Concluding.
There's something terribly wrong with the system of taxation, where we don't really tax the wealthy. Even what we did in the 1950s. I mean, we're a fraction of what we did in the 1950s, and so we have under-resourced public education systems, public health systems, in many significant respects because of that lack of it. And then we have folks coming in and saying the money that really should have gone in taxes to support public education, I will provide as my noblesse oblige with the following conditions of things that you have to do. That to me is fundamentally undemocratic.
Concluding remarks. Leo?
Well, I think there's a lot of passion up here because the issue up here is terribly important. It's something that we all, I think it's fair to say all of us up here have dedicated our professional lives to this very issue. And it continues to be the greatest challenge that we face in education. And as someone who taught for many years, the first year I taught, I had a class the last period of the day, and for those of you who've ever been a high school teacher, you know that by the end of the day you're very you're exhausted, and your students are exhausted, and so it always seems like your first period of the day is the best day when everybody's on energy. And I remember this class because I remember the first day I was reading through these names, and their parents had been very creative when they named them, and all the students were laughing as I struggled to pronounce the names for the first time. But one of the students whose names I had to pronounce that first day was a young woman named Edwidge Danticat. And she and I, she had only gotten here a year and a half before from Haiti, and our spoken English, she was still mastering, but she had this incredible writing ability, and so she would hand in homeworks that were like 6 pages long, and we would have these long dialogues in writing. And I had no idea at the time what would happen, but I think many of you know that she's gone on to be a rather well-known and quite accomplished author. And it always struck me in all of the years since then that I've done this work, that there was no better way to spend your life than to be able to have Edwidge Danticats, that you were able to get a start in life. And my frustration has always been that I just couldn't do that for many more young people.
Chantel?
So I just want to leave everybody with the notion to do better, right? Children deserve and need opportunity, and they need great schools. And I think that having conversations like these are always good. But we've got to move from just talking about it and doing something different for children, because every single day we have children dying. And my job is to make sure that the 700 that are under my watch currently, that doesn't happen. And so I think that it is very easy for us to polarize any one specific group or methodology, et cetera. And I actually appreciate Leslie's push to just think about the larger picture of how things are happening and why things are happening and who's informing the decision for whom. But I don't think that the conversation around education is unique to education. I think as a country we've got to continue to look at who we are, how we're showing up for our most neediest, and what that looks like for them on a daily basis. And I think education is the easy one, because there are bigger things to point at and say and so forth. But I think we've got to be much more critical about the systems and structures that we've set up as a country, that our country, quite frankly, has thrived off of and will continue to thrive off of. But we've got to be critical, and I still believe in the power of people and the power of what a small group can do to effectuate change, which is why I do what I do every single day in Southeast DC and will continue to do so. But I think that this is one conversation, but there are bigger conversations. We are in a political season. Believe what you want, but I think we need to make sure that we take a bigger stand and not let this just be a conversation and we all go back to our place of privilege, and understanding that there are children who are impacted daily, and they will one day make the decisions that impact us as we get older. And that's what I tell my scholars every day: y'all got to make better decisions. And so I need you to be ready, because I can't afford to have people running the country in the way that we have today. So I just say, be active and do something.
David?
I'll start off by saying, forgive the passion, but I have a student story too. My student story, happens in Lansing, Michigan, with a young man named Deshaun Stevens. Deshaun was a student of mine, and Deshaun was one of those students who came to school every day, didn't necessarily do all of his work, but that was okay, he was there. And he loved to talk. If I set him in the back of the room, he would talk. Set him in the middle, he would talk. If I set him in the front, he would talk. I set him next to me, talk to me. Just that kind of guy. Other teachers didn't like it because they couldn't control Sean. The short of it is, Sean was, suspended a lot. After a while, administration got tired of suspending Sean and expelled him. 16 years old. While out, Sean caught a case and has been in this revolving door, of the mass incarceration system ever since. And I shudder. And unlike Leo, I don't have a famous author that wakes me up in this conversation every day. I got this young man who would write me notes from his penitentiary cell to my, graduate school mailbox at Michigan State University some 10 years ago to remind me why I do this work. Carter G. Woodson said, if you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You don't have to tell him to go out the back door. He'll go without being told. And if there is no back door, he'll cut one out for his own special benefit, for his education makes it necessary. I think Steve Biko said it best. The most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Mind control. But we are pointing a direction, toward the future. But we can do better, by students like Sean, and I think it involves a collective conversation like this. I started my remarks this morning about No Excuses Schools and what it does. It allows us to make the excuse to let social and systemic oppression remain in place while we blame schools and teachers and everyone else involved in the education complex for the social realities and the social problems that we have. If I can leave with one comment, it would be a quotation from an American computer scientist, Alan Kay. He said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. My hope is that we invent a future where we move beyond the conversation of no excuses to a conversation where all students can just learn. Thanks.
Leslie.
To pick up on your point about the future, NASA is currently crafting a mission to Mars. And we have something called, I don't mean for this to rhyme, but we have something called autonomous cars. Some of us have bought those cars. And in 2016, though I think the country has come far, I think it's a shame that we're talking about this. When we can craft a chart toward Mars, when we can have cars drive themselves, why are we having this conversation about whether or not Black, brown, and poor children can learn? That's a new invention. It's an invention of about the 1960s. We don't have a how question, how to reach these Black, brown, and poor children. We have a will question. We have a quando, a when question. The no excuses doesn't need to be applied to the nation's children. It needs to be applied to governors and state legislators who create high-stakes test states, who give billions to a testing industry that energizes placing no excuses on children, the most vulnerable. And those of us in this room, those of us who are ed policy researchers, writers, teachers, we need to interrogate and investigate the program that billionaires are pushing to citizens, not only around schooling, but around many of the contours of democratic life. What is the program? What are the features of the program? Where does it show up? How does it play out? There is a program. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the speakers for a very interesting conversation.